This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Well, hello there. Welcome to the show. Man, I feel like I have lost my rhythm, and I am just struggling to get back in step, back in time. Anyway, I'll keep working on it. How's that sound? Got to keep after it. Thank you so much for tuning in. I've got to confess this to you. I'm undergoing a little bit of a personal reorganization. And so I've got a few things that are hanging in the balance. The question of whether or not to continue doing this show or to basically subsume it into some other activities that I believe are also very important. Anyway, getting that sorted out. By the way, I've taken the deep dive this week. I finally have done it. And I'm tinkering around with AI, like for serious, which doesn't mean that I know much about it, but holy cow. I know I'm very slow to get to, the parade here, but if you have been just kind of brushing to the back of your awareness, well, AI, it'll do this, it'll do that, whatever, neat toy for the kids. This is the next big shift. I don't even know where all that takes us, but there are so many things that AI is capable of doing that will basically take a lot of human beings, and I'm including myself when I say this, low skill level human beings. In other words, I don't have a lot of very specialized skills that I can offer. I can't create dentures, I don't know how to do, I don't know how to set broken bones and all that kind of stuff. But AI is going to be going places and doing things in such a way that I'm starting to understand why those who are sounding the warning of you really need to kind of have your stuff together. And it's not necessarily that, this means everybody's going to be destitute. We're all going to be slaves living on a universal basic income. I don't know that that's necessarily the case, but if you think about how much things changed just since the internet became, a normal, everyday part of life. Come on, it hasn't been that long. It's been, 30-ish years since people really started to, we got dial-up internet, and then, we graduated to more full-time kind of internet. But think how much it has changed. Everything that we do. And the same people who were telling us, be careful, this is going to go places we don't even know, are the ones who are saying, watch what happens. And I'm not talking like, 10 years from now, 40 years from now, it's going to make everything. I'm talking a year from now, 6 months from now. It's an amazing time. It's also just a little bit scary. But having said that, one of the things that I am finding that I'm still coming to terms with is, as I grew older, I guess I was under the impression that life is going to become more and more simple because, hey, you're an adult. You've had time to work on your problems. You've got things sorted out, right? The house is paid for. You've got money in retirement. And, basically you've solved all your problems. So from there, it should be much less complicated and you would have time to do as you wish. I know. I can hear people laughing going, yeah, where did you get that idea that was the way things were supposed to go? I'm not sure where I got it, but I really did sincerely believe it for a long time. But instead, what I find is, as you grow, your capability to deal with problems and to solve problems increases. And as that does, it's like the universe extends responsibility to you. And suddenly, you are being called upon to use the benefit of your experience or your wealth or your skills or your time to help others who aren't quite as far along on the trail. But I'm still, coming to terms with the fact that it doesn't get easier. As I watch my 90-year-old mom, struggle with some of the things that are just, day-to-day life for her. It occurs to me that, she's got about as simple a situation as you could get, but it doesn't necessarily get easier. It's complicated. The relationships are complicated. The forces, the incentives, as well as the disincentives that are before us. The one thing that I don't feel like I get enough time to do is to actually think for myself. Now, I know people would say, well, you could take time, and it's true, but sometimes I get kind of caught in the flow of, work and, church callings and other opportunities that come up, and I really don't take time to stop and think. Now, you may think I'm weird, and that's okay. I probably am weird, but I'll tell you, one of my favorite things in the world to do is mow the stinking lawn. It's about a 45-minute to an hour job. It's a pretty good-sized lawn. But I love to mow the lawn because it is mindless, manual labor. Now, it doesn't mean I do a crappy job, but during that time, I'm actually free to think my own thoughts. And you may think, well, that's tough with the lawnmower in, but I have noise-canceling earbuds that I put in. And really, I just kind of walk things through my mind. I know it sounds weird, but this is where I do some of my best thinking. So, for what it's worth, maybe you have something that works for you. I came across this article. This one landed in my email inbox earlier today. This is from Paul Rosenberg, The Luxury of Thinking One's Own Thoughts. And I really love the way that he puts this. By the way, I hope it's not coming through. If you're wearing headphones while you're listening to this, you might be able to hear it. One of my chickens is probably laying an egg, but she's having some kind of a noisy encounter just outside of my studio here. So if you hear her joining in, well, she's just trying to be part of the show. But back to Paul Rosenberg's article. He says, when people think of luxuries, they think of things rich people can afford, but they can't. But he says, as it happens, the luxury I'm talking about today fits into that category. I'm hearing reports of very rich people enjoying this luxury, while people of lesser means find it unattainable. So he says, I guess it's best to start this conversation very directly, even though it's a bit jarring. Nonetheless, he says, the following statement is true, and we all know it's true on some level. The greatest thought disruption system in the history of mankind is the combination of the smartphone and social media. Now, he says, I'm sorry if that's harsh, but he says it's true all the same. And I'll make the case for it by giving you some slightly edited passages from Johann Hari's books, Stolen Focus and The Anxious Generation. These are mind-blowing, by the way, these instances he gives. A study at the University of Oregon found if you are focusing on something and get interrupted, it will take an average of 23 minutes before you regain the same state of focus. This one kind of hurt too. When getting phone calls and emails, a person's IQ drops by an average of 10 points. True story. Now, this is back when cell phones were still fairly new. I'd only been carrying one for about maybe 4 or 5 years. But I was convinced I can talk on the cell phone and drive and be aware of what's going on. And that was very true right up until one day. All I was doing was pulling from the upper parking lot down to the lower parking garage of the building where I worked. And I'm on my phone talking to somebody, and suddenly I realize I'm about to directly steer into one of my fellow on-air personalities. He was sitting there waiting to pull out. I totally did not see him. And it kind of bruised my ego to admit that, well, maybe I don't drive that well when I'm, on the telephone. But something that simple. I wasn't even going far. There was nothing to distract me other than I was talking on the phone and couldn't see what was right in front of my face. Okay, back to Paul's article. Professor Earl Miller at MIT believes we created the perfect storm of cognitive degradation as a result of distraction. This is an interesting thought, too. If you see the world through fragments, your empathy doesn't often kick in, as it often does when you engage in a sustained and focused way. Plus, he says, the more you let your mind wander, undistracted, the better you are at having personal goals, being creative, and making patient long-term decisions. Here's more of the conclusions from the books. Children are being deprived of the chance to develop intrinsic motives. In 2017, the president of Facebook asked, how do we consume as much of your time and conscious attention as possible? Wow. Did you know Zuckerberg had said that? And yet I sit here and think about, the places where I get caught up and just scroll and scroll and scroll. Facebook is one of them. They've got my number. And of course, Paul adds to this. He says, on average, Americans check their smartphones 205 times per day. Oh, that one stings. But if there's even like the slightest lull in conversation, whoop, out comes the phone. All right, let's check and see. Is the president trying to get back to me on something? All right, how about the Russians? They looking for some muscle? Anyway. So let's talk about the luxury of thinking one's own thoughts. Paul Rosenberg says the luxury I'm addressing is one that sets us free from ruinous distraction, both ruinous in the short and long term. Now, he says, back in the 1990s, I trained my friends and business associates to contact me via email, and I did it for one simple reason, and that is email didn't distract me. I might check it 10 times a day, but those would be at times that I chose, not times which were thrust upon me and which interrupted my thoughts. And he says, I did that because I had earlier noticed how badly distractions and interruptions ruined my work. And I very much needed to remain productive in those years. So for a very long time, in the years before email, I worked at night, slept during the day, because it was worth it to think unobstructed thoughts. In other words, I got a lot more done. Now, there's a solution here, but this is one that I guarantee a lot of people are going to go, hey, I don't know about that. That sounds kind of extreme. I know, because that was kind of my first reaction. Paul says, look, if you want to obtain this luxury of being able to think your own thoughts, turn in your smartphone for an old-style flip phone. In other words, one which will do just fine for phone calls and can even receive and send texts when you need to. It will make you functionally smarter and more creative, and it'll even save you money. The only real cost involved is that of letting people think you're weird, or perhaps breaking your addiction to the phones. If that affects you, he says, you have my condolences, but he says, please remember this little phrase: smartphones and Facebook are the new smoking. Whoa! Yeah, that one kind of landed low, didn't it? He's not wrong, though, which is why that one hurt. Anyway, Paul Rosenberg says it wasn't many years ago, of course, that no one had smartphones, and we survived just fine. Not too long before that, we had no mobile phones at all, and we survived that as well. So this artificial need or this particular need, he says, is artificial. It's not essential. And if your experience is anything like mine, you'll actually be happy you ditched the thing. You'll love being free to think your own thoughts. That said, he says, breaking the addiction can be very hard. He escaped that part. So, it's seemingly mundane, real-world events that cement things in us. For him, that moment came during a taxi ride. He settled into the cab, asked one of those new screen systems flipped on and started showing him ads. And he says, I asked the driver to turn it off and added, I want to think my own thoughts. And he says, and I really did. They were far more fruitful than being subjected to uninvited hucksters trying to pull money out of me. Interesting thought. So, he says, I think this makes a nice model for all of us. Turn the thing off and think your own thoughts. Your own thoughts will serve you far, far better than thoughts implanted in you by paying strangers and by people whose income depends upon addicting you. That is probably one of the most straightforward columns that I have seen from Paul Rosenberg. And I check this guy's writings on a very regular basis. I think he's a fantastic thinker and writer. But that one hits hard. Give up my smartphone? Maybe you just need to separate from it. But I think if you feel anxiety at the thought of, well, I guess I could put it down for a few minutes, you probably see the depth of the addiction that he's talking about here. Anyway, take a look at the article. It's in my show notes at thebryanhydeshow.com. Show notes for May 14th, 2025. Two other quick articles that I wanted to point out to you. One is an essay from Jeff Thomas called It's Not If, It's When. And he's talking about the Sword of Damocles, which, if you're not familiar with this, Cicero talked about it with the Sword of Damocles. Being leader of a country is like having a sword constantly dangling over your head from a single horsehair. You never know if or when the sword is going to cause your demise, but you know the danger is ever present. And Jeff Thomas says that's as true in our time as it was in Cicero's time, but the modern Sword of Damocles isn't just hanging over the heads of the world's leaders. It actually hangs over the heads of the populations as well. And his point here is if you rely on the conventional media for our interpretation of world economic and political conditions, we may well be scratching our heads continuously as to what needs to be done to save the situation. Whether the discussion is over the debts of nations, the likelihood of war, or the increase in the loss of rights, the governments of the world are very much headed in a similar direction. It's not a positive one. But the pundits in the media offer a wide variety of solutions for the problems being discussed. The solution to national debt is either expand monetization or to back off on it, depending on who's speaking at the moment. But he says whether debt monetization is the right thing to do in the first place, well, that's rarely discussed. The solution to Middle East problems was either arm the rebels or send in the military. But the solution to domestic terrorism is either build up the power of the various authorities or pass more dramatic laws restricting basic freedoms. And so he says we're to be forgiven if we imagine that the solution to such problems lies in whether we choose one destructive approach or another. In fact, he says, truth be told, the most difficult assessment for us to make is that we should sit very far back from the rhetoric and ask ourselves, is a solution even possible at this point, or have the powers that be gone past the point of no return? And from here he gives some reasons why the problems won't be solved. Starting with the debt, the most prominent countries of the world, the point of no return has probably been reached by most. And he says once you get the present level of debt that's been reached, no amount of monetization will save the economy. It might be possible to give the addict another injection of heroin to stave off the immediate withdrawal symptoms, but at some point, it's going to become necessary to go cold turkey, which may be a very painful thing to do, but it's truly the only solution. A country cannot reach solvency through increased debt. But of course, political leaders, well, they're loath to go cold turkey, because to do so is to cut the horsehair that holds the sword hanging above their careers. Nope, better to push that solution farther into ruin if it can buy them a little more time. So as regards the rapid deterioration into police states that we see happening in so many countries, no amount of discussion by pundits in the media is going to reverse the present destruction of basic rights. That's because the decision is not in their hands. It's in the hands of Congresses, parliaments, presidents, and prime ministers. They know that very soon the facade of economic recovery is going to come tumbling down, and they have no intention of allowing the populace to have the basic freedom of removing them from power once the veil has been removed from the lie that a solution is in the works. And this next part is so true. Political leaders whose hold over power is in danger, will always do whatever is necessary to retain that power. So, as regards warfare, it's interesting that none of the pundits who discuss the subject in the media ever raise the question, how can a country that's facing bankruptcy possibly fund a war, traditionally the most expensive undertaking for any country in any era? Yet throughout history, political leaders often use warfare as a distraction when government reaches the tipping point economically. It's a great quote here from Hermann Göring, who says, "The people can always be brought to do the bidding of the leaders. That's easy. All you have to do is tell them they're being attacked, denounce the peacemakers for lack of patriotism, and exposing the country to danger. It works the same in any country." Now, Jeff Thomas says the disconnect here seems to be that the populace seems to believe that the governments of the West sincerely hope to avoid war. So the discussion in the media revolves around what can be done to that end. But far from seeking peace, the governments of the day consciously seek to create war. After all, a populace that's unhappy with its government tends to toe the line if the country's at war. Further, the government has a greater ability to silence domestic detractors during time of war. Thus, the ability to hold power is assured because a state of war is the single most effective tool in silencing dissent in any country. Now, I get this is not a very pleasant thing to think about, but look at the countries of Europe and how they are chomping at the bit to go to war over Ukraine, with Ukraine as an excuse. I don't know, but they want to go to war with Russia, and it looks like they're likely going to get their wish. The big question then is, do they drag the U.S. as part of NATO, kicking and screaming into their conflict? So, in considering all the above, Jeff Thomas says not only is a present-day anomaly, but is a recurrent theme throughout history. Any discussion of if there will be an economic collapse, if there will be an increase in the loss of basic freedoms, if there will be a ramping up of warfare, becomes a non-starter because it's a question of when. And of course, in spite of this, there will be those individuals who say, well, I like to be positive, I'm going to hope for the best, but in truth, this is not positive thinking at all. If we see the truth before our eyes and then cover our eyes in order to be positive, we're merely delving into self-deception. Positive thinking, he says, begins with truth. once we accept what's true, we may then be as positive or as negative as we wish regarding what that truth means to us. If we are faced with the fact that much of the world is, once again, passing through the classic cycle of economic decline or removal of rights and distraction of war, we can either shut our eyes to that fact and hope for the best, or we can open our eyes and recognize that the one choice left to us is to try to step aside of coming events. As Benjamin Ala Akande wrote, hope is not a strategy. So listen to what he's saying here. You don't have to solve the big transnational problems, but you should definitely be thinking about your next move for yourself. Jeff Thomas says, if we recognize that the Sword of Damocles is indeed hovering above our own heads, we would be unwise to continue to sit below it and ponder whether that horsehair may break. Instead, we should understand that our very first move should be to put some physical distance between ourselves and the potential harm that unquestionably hangs over us. I know that raises a lot of very interesting possibilities. On that note, I'm sure we'll have much more to talk about in future shows about it, but I would encourage you, look at the article of the day. I've reshared an article written by Jacob Hornberger. This was published, I think, back in 2016, so it's been almost a decade. But it's a breakdown of gun control and the right to resist tyranny. And everything he says in here is as true today as it was then. It is information you'll probably be glad to have tucked away there in the recesses of your mind, or perhaps in a corner of your heart. Might even be a good one to draw upon at a moment when you need strength. Check out my show notes at thebryanhydeshow.com. Show notes for May 14th, 2025.
This is The Bryan Hyde Show.